Hopefully you can all see the presentation, as I say, which is on the screen there. So yeah, introductions, and I guess you all know me. My name is Barry Jackson. I'm Head of Information Governance at N3i. I'm the Data Protection Officer for most of the practices, and I provide an information governance service to you all. So this is a part of that. The service is provided in different ways, predominantly the information that we provide out through the Information Governance Portal, which we'll link to in a moment, and I'll show you also how to look at that. I would ask you to keep checking back on there. I try not to send out emails too often, but I certainly don't send out an email every time I update stuff on the portal, so it's always worth having a quick check. We are also looking at improving the portal. I'm working with our team at the moment to make it a bit more user friendly, but also more importantly, so you can look on it and see the latest stuff. Or certainly also possibly even see the stuff that's been updated since the last time you looked, that type of thing. So we're going to try and get that going. So the portal is our main method of communication with you guys. And then occasional webinars like this. Sometimes we do general ones, sometimes specific, and obviously this is the second of the ones that we're doing in relation to NHS England's accelerating patient online access, which was due to start at the beginning of December, as you well know, but it's now going to start in April, so the systems will be switched on in April. Yeah, I'll talk about it when I get to it. I'll go off at a tangent as I occasionally do and talk about things before I'm meant to get there. So there are a few things I was going to talk about. We'll cover that when we get to it. There's just a couple of other things I wanted to put on this morning, and I won't labour them. We'll keep it very brief because I appreciate many of you probably just come on for the patient online stuff. We'll get to that in a moment. But there were just a couple of other things I wanted to quickly go through. So this is what we're going to look at. Very briefly, medical examiners, and then the COVID vaccination information bit, and then we'll get to accelerating patient online access. Okay, can just ask everyone to go on mute, please? I can hear someone furiously typing away there. I don't know what that is, but I guess you got some very important stuff to go on. But yeah, it is a bit, I can just hear a bit of feedback going on. That'd be great. So medical examiners, yeah, this is a new one that's just has come out. I'm sure you've seen information about it. I just picked up on it on a national call the other day, and I thought I'll just mention it this morning just to make sure everyone's clear about it. So the NHS are introducing this concept of medical examiners. There's a lot of stuff on there. There's stuff already. There's a very brief intro to it on the IG portal, and I'm going to expand that today because I've got some more information about what the system is, how it will work. The key issue at the moment for them is that it's been introduced on a non-statutory basis. However, that's only essentially because the law that's required to put it on a statutory basis hasn't gone through Parliament. So that the intention is that it will become statutory, and therefore, you know, your right to process and your requirement to process data will actually be written into the law. At the moment, it isn't. However, they do have a Section 251 approval, and of course, we're talking about access to deceased patients' records as well. So, and the interesting part about it is that it's in that almost that immediate space between when a person has passed away, then their data, and this can sound a bit cold and clinical, I know, but the law relating to their data is no longer the GDPR and Data Protection Act, but others such as medical examiners will have a right and a need to be able to look at it. Yet at the same time, you possibly don't want to go too far into the Access to Health Records Act, which is a very complex piece of legislation and actually is best dealt with by PCSE. And we've had many discussions around access to deceased records. And my view, as hopefully you all know, is that it's absolutely nothing to do with primary care. You guys pass that straight on to PCSE. They're totally responsible for the record. The medical examiner bit is going to be in that in-between stage where a person is just deceased. Very quickly, the MEs will be looking at the case. Yet you probably won't, in many cases, you may not even have marked them on the record on the clinical system as being deceased. You know, we're talking about the MEs will be employed, as I understand it, through hospitals. They may actually be aware of the death of a patient before you are, and will be coming to look at and do their work and needing access to the record, say almost in some cases before you may even have marked it. The complicating factor there is, of course, that when you do mark a record as deceased, it changes the right of access and the way it can be accessed and the permissions you need to access the record. So there their right of access, and I've put on there, their right of access is there. It's slightly a little bit messy at the moment, if you like. That's probably the best way to put it, but it is there, and it certainly will be in the future once the whole system gets put on a better, more statutory basis. However, actually, the more difficult bit, I suspect, is going to be the practicality of access. How do they get access to the record that you hold in order to carry out their role? And I've seen things which, please don't anyone do this, but I know in the pilot they had in Sheffield, they ended up faxing hundreds of pages of records around. That to me is just absolute nonsense, and I certainly wouldn't suggest that any of our practices should do that. We need to come up with a practical way of doing this, and that's really, I guess, is what we're going to be doing, or what the rollout team are going to be doing over the next few weeks and months. So that's it really. If you've got any queries about MEs, as I say, I'll be putting a little more stuff on the blog post I've done about it on the portal later today. I've got some more information just from something I was out this week. But obviously, if you've got any specific queries, just drop me an email, as I always say, on any of this sort of stuff. Right. As I know you're very much aware, the government passed legislation for COVID vaccinations for all primary care or all patient-facing staff. Forget the exact, but you know what I mean. To be required to be vaccinated. Let me just see if I can pull up something here that I wanted to show you. So this is actually a really good document that I found this morning. I'm sure you've seen this. Vaccination as a condition of deployment for healthcare workers. This is what you should be looking at, I guess. It talks about obviously planning and preparation, how you go through, the actions you should be taking, and all that other good stuff. So if you haven't seen this, let me just put this into the meeting chat, if I can do that. If I can remember how to get this. Yeah, there we go. So if you haven't seen that, that's in the meeting chat now. And let me go back to this. So what it does, the IG aspects of this are the legal basis to process staff information for you to be able to carry out your legal duty as required by the law now, to ensure that all of your staff who are in a patient-facing role have been fully vaccinated. Your legal basis to process data at the moment is the COPI notice. That gives you the legal right to be able to do it. Once the legislation has fully passed through Parliament and been signed off as official, then the legislation itself becomes your legal basis. But at the moment already, you have the legal basis under the COPI notice to be able to process data. And that's what we're talking about. That is, you're able to ask staff what their vaccination status is, and you're able to hold that data. And we'll talk about the one. There's a few things that you need to just to be aware of. And it talks about the planning document says identifying the staff roles that you'll have that will fit in the parameters, and there's quite a clear definition of the parameter of patient facing, and the fact that you can ask staff for their status now. You can start doing this work. This is mostly an HR issue after you've done the initial bit. So all I'm talking about here is the information governance, which is, can you process the data? Because it's quite a relevant question, and it certainly has been asked. And as I mentioned just earlier on, for those of you who were on the call at the beginning, or when I was just getting ready to start, I was saying there's a specific email that's going around, and it looks very official and it goes into an awful lot of detail, but it isn't accurate. And it's there's an official response to it by NHS England that kind of sets out why it's not accurate. As I said earlier, I think written by Karen on Facebook, but that's probably been a bit cynical. There will be members of staff who will have a specific issue with this. I'm sure we all know that, and I'm sure you probably know who they are. So what I would say is using that document that NHS England have provided and being very clear about your process. So in terms of the IG bit, I just picked out a section. This is the IG section from that document. As I say, I think it's very good. But just to quickly run through this, the sort of stuff that obviously I would advise you to do anyway, and obviously the NHS England have received some very good advice. So what they recommend that you do is, as I said, point one, be clear with workers about what you're doing, what the details that you need are, and how much data you're going to collect. And it says updated privacy notice. I think you could probably just put together a paragraph that's, from this, essentially this sort of information that just says, this is what we're going to do, this is how long we're going to hold your data, this is why we're doing it, this is our legal basis, it's been approved by the organization, the colleague of guardian signed it off. You could put together a little paragraph, and I would suggest you send that around to staff and stick it onto your privacy notice as well. Point 2, work with staff side representatives. I'm sure you guys are familiar with what you need to do there and other stakeholder groups. Involve the employer's data protection officer. Hey, that's me for most of you, and where applicable, a colleague or guardian. So yeah, I mean, I endorse the NHS England document, really, and this is my sort of guidance as well. I just say follow this in terms of information governance, and you won't be going wrong anywhere. Point 4, we'll get into the important details now about who can have this data. So if you're going to collect this data, you need to be careful about how it's being held. It needs to be held securely, and you need to have limited access, and you need to be clear who's going to access it. So obviously practice manager, potentially colleague or guardian, and senior partner, so something like that. But you need to have a documented small group of people who will have this data, have access to it, and who will be aware of it. And it will be held, as I say, not discussed openly, and held just for their use, and also just for this purpose, just for the purpose of this legislation and this process that we're doing. So point 5 then is kind of follows directly on from that. How long you're going to keep the data, and how you'll keep it. Think of what retention schedules around staff data and so on. I mean, the law itself, as long as it requires staff to have this vaccination bit, eventually, and I'm not sure if I've seen the legislation, it talks about having what they call a sunset clause in the legislation, where at some point it will cease. At that point, we'll need to do something else. Either the requirement will stop, but at this moment we don't really know what that is. So I suspect we just say at the moment it's for the length of the pandemic, until that ends, and then you'd review it and see how much longer, or if it's appropriate to still keep the data. Have a policy and a documented risks versus benefits assessment. Well, the risk versus benefit is the risk is that you need to comply with the law, which, as we said, has passed through Parliament now. The risk of not complying with the law would be fairly significant. I think the document, the NHS England document, and the law itself talks very much about CQC registered activities, which potentially is pretty much all the stuff that you're doing within general practice. The risk of a general practice deciding to not comply with the law, and therefore have staff who are not able to, who are in breach of the law and not able to comply with their CQC requirements. I don't know. I don't want to go too far down that line, but you can probably see where it's going. That's the risk for the practice. The benefit of the practice is staying within the law, I would have thought. I'm not really quite sure how a risk versus benefits assessment would be any more than that. Certainly from a data protection point of view, the risk of essentially breaching the law would be quite significant. The benefit of staying within the law is also probably fairly obvious. Okay, so that's the information governance aspects of the vaccination program as it's been, and of this requirement for you to have only vaccinated staff in roles that are patient facing. Again, I'll stick some more of this stuff on the portal later on. Any queries, any specific queries about it, please just come to me. Okay, this is what we came here for. Accelerating patient online access. Okay, so a little bit of background then. As you know, the program was really started up, I guess, October time, and they originally said it's going to be launched in December. And when they talk about launch, essentially it's the clinical system providers flicking a switch to turn it on to make it this system available. So what the system is, and I'm sure you're all aware of this, but just to give you the background, it's giving patients online access. A couple of points. It's from the point of switch on going forward. So patients will have access to their medical record from that point forward. They will only have access to it from their registered practice. Now, this is a slightly odd one, and I have asked for some clarification, but certainly as I understood it from the recent webinar that I was on, if you move practices, you will lose that online access to your previous record, and it will only be the data that's provided at your registered, current registered practice. But I think we need to a bit more clarity in that. It is what a lot of patients will already have, of course. There are various different ways in which this has been moving forward over the years, really, since I think the document I saw was about 2015 when the concepts first came in, that patients could have online access. They can get it through their system apps. So I'm pretty sure EMIS does, but I know because I actually have it, that System 1 has an online app that you can get, that once you've applied for it and you get your password and stuff from the practice and they switch it on your record, you can see your own record through that way. Obviously, what's happened more recently now is the NHS app has come along, and it will also link back to your patient record. And of course, there have been huge numbers of deployments of the NHS app because people need it for their COVID passports. But as a sideline to it, it allows patients to also access their record. So at the moment, patients have to request that access, and within a practice, you grant it and you go into the system and switch it on. Again, when you switch it on, you can do the kind of switch on from today if you like. You don't need to give people historic access, although you can do if you wish, and many practices have done that and have granted access to their full record. There's a difference between accessing the coded record and stuff like that, but these things are available now, and many people have taken up. And I think as a practice, your contract requires you to have something like 20% of patients actively using online access, and you should be offering it to every new patient that comes along. So what this new system will do is it will change that default from being a patient having to ask for it to it being available to the patient. And by default, if you have the NHS app, you'll be able to see your online your record, as I say, from the point at which the system switched on, which we expect to be now April. So I think at the moment that's as much as we know about the programme. There are some briefings going forward by NHS England around it. They did a slight pause last month, but they've started again, and I saw online that there are ones available. So I will certainly, what I said is I'll certainly be attending them and picking up as much information I can, and then I'll be kind of rebroadcasting the hopefully the useful parts to you guys. But I also suggest if you want to get on there, you should get on it yourselves and hear it from the horse's mouth, as it were. But what I will do with these over the next 3 months, as we lead up to April, we'll do some specific ones like I'm doing today about aspects of the patient online access. So what we're going to look at today, I thought, was about redacted information. That is the information which a patient, or which you can legitimately stop the patient from having access to. So we're going to quickly look at that. Yeah, that's it really. And we'll obviously do some questions at the end if there's anything interesting. So there are two types of information which can be redacted when a person asks for their health record. So at the moment, as you'll know, you'll get individuals come along and say, can I have access to my record? And that concept is a subject access request. And you will presumably pick out their record. You'll go through it to check that there is no information that needs to be redacted. You'll apply the 2 tests around serious harm and third-party information. Then you'll give the patient the record. Essentially, as you can already realize, what patient online access does is, because it's given patients a real-time view of their record, you're going to have to do that check in real time as well. So a patient could come to the practice, again, this is as I understand it, could come to the practice, could go online. Yeah, no, I was right. Okay, start a little bit again. A patient could come to the practice for a consultation and could do whatever, possibly have a test, a blood test perhaps, or whatever it is, a little small episode of care, and go away again. And pretty much the next day, I'm not quite sure how real time it is, but certainly I would have thought the next day they could look online and they would see the details of that consultation. So it's that close to being real time that you're going to need to be doing things. The 2 redaction tests are almost going to need to be done in real time as you're going along. So you're not going to have the ability to kind of sit back and, okay, we've got 30 working days to sit and go through this. It needs to be done in real time. And that's the big business change and process change within a practice that you'll need to kind of think about. So we talk about redacted information. Let's look at what we're talking about here. My assessment is that many practices do this too much. I'm not being critical here, but these should be very rare events. Patients are legally entitled to have access to all of their information that's about them, and to prevent that happening, if you're talking about withdrawing information or denying them access to information which they're legally allowed, that's a very serious position to be in. So let's look at the two of them, and what I'll show you on here would be where you can see a bit more information about them anyway. So this, as hopefully you all know, this is our IG portal, and fact sheets on here. There are the two we're going to look at: the serious harm test. So see if that makes that a bit easier. So this is the serious harm test, fact sheet number 22. The exact law says at point number 3, you're exempt from complying with a SAR for health data to the extent that complying with the right of access would be likely to cause serious harm to the physical or mental health of any individual. There's one point in there to mention, one word which isn't mentioned, but which seems to come up all the time, and that is sensitive or sensitivity. That is not part of the test here. Our medical records will contain lots of information which is sensitive, lots of information which is very sensitive. That's not the test. You cannot exempt information based on sensitivity. It's based on the serious harm that would be done to an individual by simply telling them the data that's in there. And if you think logically about that, there's very little actually that will going to cause people serious harm. And certainly I can't really think of any physical conditions. So we're talking about mental health conditions here. We're talking about and we're talking very serious mental health conditions where you'd cause serious harm to the individual. Okay. So there are some examples. The BMA guidance is very good. And as they say there, circumstances in which information will be withheld on the grounds of serious harm are extremely rare. I wouldn't imagine you'd be doing more than, I don't know, off the top of my head, one a year, if that, about redacting information due to serious harm. It really should be a very extreme occurrence. Okay, and as the BMA guidance goes on to say, the exemption doesn't justify withholding comments in the record because patients might find them upsetting, and as we mentioned, or because it's particularly sensitive information. And remember, if the patient knows the information, you can't redact it. There's no point to doing that. If the patient already knows it, then it doesn't fall within this requirement, because what are you achieving by essentially not telling them it? They already know it. Okay, so and it goes through there to say there are some examples of stuff that may not be information that hasn't been communicated to a patient. That's almost a separate bit, and we're going to cover that separately, because in this whole scenario around patient access to online records in real time, or as near real time as the system is going to allow, one of the very significant questions that's come up are things around test results. And so test results are going to be a whole separate thing that we'll talk about, but it does mention there, paragraph 6 there, it could be a category of information that you want to withhold, and absolutely it will be, but we'll look at it separately for that specific reason. I think the better examples of the sort of stuff that you could withhold: historical abuse suffered as a child, which certain patients may not even be aware took place. That would be a good example of something that would be withheld them, because that could have a serious impact, and could cause them serious harm to their mental health if it's something that happened to them as an infant that they weren't aware of. Okay, so it obviously, if you do go down the route of exempting information on the serious harm test, it needs the approval of the patient's doctor, the person who's currently involved in their care, and you must be able to set out and justify why you're taking that course of action. Okay, so that's the serious harm test. Please have a think through, and what you've got the opportunity at the moment to do is, in advance of this going live in April, is to look at your current processes. So you'll currently be going through this when you do your subject access requests. Whoever does that within the practice, talk through with them. If it's yourself, have a think through when you're doing them over the next few weeks, and just visualize that how are you going to do this when this is online? Are you applying these tests correctly? So let's have a look at the other one, which is down here, the third-party data one. This is one that I have to say almost slightly confused me a little bit when I thought about it, and I'll try to get my head around and understand it. And I put on there, yes, it is frequently used, but not always understood. Again, there is some good guidance around there from other areas as well. But one point that's made and that comes through is that you don't need, if the patient already knows it, similar to the serious harm test, if the patient already knows the information, then you don't need to redact it. It needs to be confidential information about a third party, something the patient doesn't know or isn't aware of. And there's I quite like this little scenario because I was struggling a little bit with it, and when I read this, I see, okay, I see what that means. So hopefully you get a concept of what that means there. So patient, in this case, Mr. Bart Simpson, attends a practice with his parents, and he has a ingrowing toenail, as it says there, and his mum says that his sister also had the same problem. Bart later makes a request for a copy of his records. He already knows who these people are. He already knows that his mum and dad took him to see the doctor, and that when they were there, they discussed the fact that there was an issue with his sister that had the same thing. He knows this information, so you don't need to redact their names at that point. Okay, I think that's quite a good little way of thinking about it. If he knows it, then you don't need to redact it. There's a bit about healthcare workers as well. Yeah, in general, the basic principle is that your names will be in the system. If you go and access a record, it will create an audit trail against your name, obviously the name of the person who's accessed it based on their smart card access, the person who gives treatment or care or anything like that, that the name will be in the record, and that can't be redacted either. The only exemption is where it says here there's a real and credible threat to a healthcare worker. Again, you will be aware of these cases. There will be cases like this, but they'll be very, very rare. So the default is clearly that healthcare workers, people providing care and treatment, their names will be in the record and they will be releasable to the individual when you request for his record. Okay, so they're the only two pieces of data that can be withheld from the individual when he asks for his record. Let me just quickly go back to this. I'm just going to slightly off subject, but very quickly show you something on here. Hopefully you're familiar with it, the latest stuff we do on here. What was I going to show you? Yeah, where the video will be. So the latest video was the one I did at the end of November, and that's where, if you go in the videos, that's where this one will be. So hopefully by around lunchtime, if anyone wants to go and have a look at it. And that's our IG portal. Please have a look at it as often as you can and check back on there. Right, let's just so yeah, I think that's all I've got really for this morning. I wanted to just say we'll break this down into little bits. I think the redacting information is probably one of the most significant ones. I said in terms of a business change, those two tests which you currently apply when you receive a formal request for information essentially will need to be done as you go along. And both systems, EMIS and System 1, have the ability to be able to mark anything in a patient record as not to show on the patient view. Quite exactly what it says, but I'm going to pick up on that. I realized this morning when I was thinking this through, I need to have a kind of a screen view of that, so you can see this is what you do. I think you tick a box and it will exempt that section of the record from being viewable on the patient online. Also, you can change that. It may be just a short because you want to quickly check something, and then you make it available, or you leave it as being it will never show on the record. But yeah, we'll break this stuff up as we go through this, and we'll get to learn a little bit more about it. Questions? If you've got any questions at all, if you want to put them to me or go direct to the NHS team that are rolling this out through their briefings, or put them to me. I had a couple last week. I've asked about the bit where it says you're only going to see the record from your current GP practice. With another question about letters that get attached, how will that work? I had an interesting question from someone who said, what will happen if a patient looks on there and sees a letter from that's not for them, that's been put on an error and it should be to someone else? And I thought about it, and actually the premise of the question was, wouldn't that be a horrible thing? It'll be really bad, and what is going to be the outcome? And actually, it's not when you think about it. It's a really good thing. Well, it's a bad thing that it happened. Errors will happen all the time. They're bad things, but if we kind of accept that that potentially could happen at some time in the future, if the patient picks up on it, that's a good thing, because your data quality will be improved then, because the patient will hopefully come back to you and say, I've noticed on here that this letter's not for me, it's for someone else, and gives you the opportunity to fix it. So it might seem like a bad thing that patients will potentially see that their, the content of the record isn't always accurate, isn't always correct, but it gives them the ability to be able to check it and to hopefully and to get it corrected. Obviously, patients have the right to rectification. We've spoken of that before, and it's strange. And I was I was out walking the dog this morning, thinking this presentation through, and this little point came to me that years ago I was in the military. I don't know if any of the rest of you were. And one thing we used to do every year, we used to have to go to our medical center, and they actually made you read your own medical record. And the point of that was, because the military people move around so much, that was a way of data quality, of you checking that your record was up to date. And you have to sign and say, yep, I've checked it this year, it's still there, still all up to date, and it's still accurate. And essentially, this is going to give patients the ability to do that, and if necessary, to improve the accuracy of their record. Certainly to point out any errors such as that, you put the wrong letter on. I know what many of you are thinking. Yes, it's also going to give people the ability to constantly question things and initiate dialogues about stuff. Yes, I'm afraid I suspect that is an unwanted outcome of this, but I think we have to be positive about it. The purpose here of this isn't to discuss whether this is a good or a bad thing. If I'm honest, I don't want to go down that route. My role here is to hopefully help you to come to terms and to work out how you're going to deal with this system when it gets switched on in April. It's not really to argue about whether it's a good or a bad thing. So yes, I am trying to see some of the positives out of it as well, but that's really just because my assessment is that this is going to happen. I know, again, there's some discussion about whether it'll be like another of those NHS digital things like care.data or the GP extraction service replacement that eventually get binned because there's a huge outcry on social media against them. I don't think this is going to be very different, because there's no outcry against this. There's no real, certainly from the public. If anything, the outcry is from you guys who are mostly affected by it across general practice. I know there's quite a lot of pushback to it, but my assessment is that because of that, there's no big public thing, and in fact, I suspect the majority of the public think this is probably quite a good idea. It's given them their legal right without putting what they would probably see as barriers in place. So that's just my view. Yeah, we'll keep doing these things, and we'll keep trying to talk you through and to provide advice and assistance where I can. And any questions, put them to me, and I will pass them on to the team. Yeah, what the two? There was one more question I'd had already. Was it, yeah, within System 1, where you have the shared care record, where you have links to other units? Was anything else going to display? And again, I think my initial feeling from what I'd heard on the original ones is that no, the patient will only see the information that's entered actually at your unit, at the GP practice. I don't think they will yet see information that's entered at other System 1 units, even where there's shares in place. But again, that's a question that we've asked, and hopefully we'll get some clarity on that pretty soon. Okay, well, that's all I've got this morning. Thank you all for coming along. And if there are any questions, if anyone wants to chuck something at me now. Oh, hang on. Aha. I wasn't looking at the chat. Yeah, Anthony, good point. You would, if so. You're talking here about the scenario I just described, where potentially a patient says to you, "I've got a letter here that's been entered in error on my record." You say, "I have to inform the patient whose letter it was intended for. What happened to report?" Absolutely, and that is the case now. So I'm not saying that it changes anything. If the error has been made, and as I said, potentially errors are made, and also and they're always going to happen, What you'd want if an error is made is you would want it to be rectified as soon as possible. Now, if you enter a record, the wrong letter onto a patient record, I suggest it could possibly sit there for quite a long time before someone at the practice realized it. In this scenario now, with a patient looking at it all the time as they do, then potentially they would notice it and tell you, which, as I say, is hopefully a good thing in terms of data quality. If the error has been made, this system doesn't make the error any worse or any better. It just allows the patient the opportunity to identify that the error has been made. Now, you say it would be reportable. It would. However, if you report through the Data Security and Protection Toolkit, my assessment would be that it wouldn't be reportable to the ICO because it's only a single patient involved and the letter was held within the secure system. The unknown element is what the patient who receives who's able to see the wrong patient letter, what they do with it. We can't require people to maintain confidentiality. You could very well go off and contact the other patient and say, "Oh, I found one of my letters," and that's your kind of not quite nightmare scenario, but that would be the worst outcome. And you'd hope that wouldn't happen. But at the end of the day, he's only doing that because the error has occurred in the first place. You would hope he would simply come back to you and you'd fix the error. You'd report it. It wouldn't be reportable, but it would be a learning lesson. Linda says that the patient would need to be informed of the data breach. Would like confirmation of this. Yeah, the problem is, Linda, it's not, as with many things, there isn't a definitive confirmation. I've had this very question, and I've had real-time scenarios where this has happened, where there's been a data breach, and we've had to say there are times when you don't have to tell the patient. The default would be that you should. So you're quite correct. The default position is where there's been a data breach and the patient has been involved. They may not know, as you say, if a letter from one patient gets put onto the other patient realizes it and tells you what's happened. Do you go back to the original patient and tell them? So the default is that yes, you should. However, you should do an assessment, and if your assessment says that there could be a number of reasons why not. I'm trying to think of the scenario that we had where we decided not to. It was a fairly it wasn't quite a straightforward one. Things never are, of course. But it involved two patients who knew each other, and therefore our assessment was, as the first patient who noticed the error absolutely wasn't going to say anything, our assessment was it would just create more of an issue, a problem, potentially even a mental health issue. It was quite a serious thing, that we took the decision that we wouldn't tell the patient what had happened, that their data had been breached. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion around that. We had to document it. We did a whole risk assessment and had it approved by the College Clerk Guardian. And that is an unusual thing to do. In most cases, things such as well, the data protection itself would generally require you to inform people, but your duty of candor and that type of stuff would say that you should tell them, but you don't have to. If there are certain circumstances which occasionally will come up where, do you know what, you really feel that it doesn't warrant telling them, perhaps because of either the seriousness of what could happen, or sometimes just because of the small significance of what it is. If it's a very minor issue, then perhaps that would go to. But all these things will be taken into account, and sometimes you don't need to do it. But the majority of cases, you're quite right, Linda. You should tell the patients what happened. Okay, I think they're the only questions that are on there. Right. If there's nothing else, please, as I said, as always, please drop me a line and just drop me an email, barry.jackson@nhs.net. If you think of any questions, anything at all, and I'll say this presentation will be on the portal later on today. I'll send it round. I've got a couple of things I wanted to send out as well anyway, which I'll try and get done just before Christmas. And we'll be doing more of these. So anything else, just let me know, and I'll keep you up to date with this as we carry on, as we go through the year. I hope you have a fantastic Christmas, everyone, and I'll speak to you again soon. Thanks very much. Cheers, guys. Thank you.